this morning. You're very welcome this morning. And I first of all will point out to you, because you'll have got a hint of it there, we are recording the session up until questions at the end, at which time we'll stop recording. And we're using the recording for people who weren't able to come today, but also for training going ahead and promotional purposes. So if we could move the slide on, please, Marie. There are two organizations working together on this initiative. There's our own, which is the Equality Commission, and then there are our partners, Business in the Community. So we're running this initiative jointly. This is the third session, and the aim of this is to promote good practice in relation to race equality in the workplace. And we are hoping that after our fourth event, which will be early next year, we're looking at compiling good practice resources and including perhaps some video material of race issues in the workplace, perhaps. And I'll be talking to Brendan Graham about that, who I see is in the session. So that is something we're keen to do. We're keen to get Northern Ireland focused materials for good practice in relation to race for employers here in Northern Ireland. So there are three of us presenting today. There we are on the list. I'm in the middle, and my colleague Stephany McConnell, who's head of workplace in BITC, will be talking after me. And then my colleague Roisin Kelly will be finishing the session before we have a questions and answer session. And Roisin and Marie from BITC will be compiling the questions. And if at that point, we'll have a short questions and answer session. So some ground rules to help this be a good learning experience for you is it's better to keep your microphone off. And if you've got connectivity issues, it's better not to share your screen. Basically, we can't allow screenshots because of GDPR, but we are recording the event. And we will not be recording the question and answer session for reasons of anonymity, as you will have gathered. Questions and answers will be part of this session. We're looking to you to ask some questions. Please ask anything you want. And please don't go away with any unanswered questions. There is no point in doing that. So we're very keen that you do that. We're suggesting that you put your questions in the chat function. And the advantage of that is that you can put your questions in there as we go through the session, so you're not going to forget them or anything like that. So that's a good idea to do that. Then Marie and Roisin will compile them, and we'll get down to answering some questions. We'll also give you connection details of our organization so you can contact us. And finally, Stephany will be talking about our plans going forward in a little bit more detail. So that's by way of background. So if we could move on to the next slide, Marie. Basically, the session today, as I mentioned, it's split into three. I'll be going through recent case law, principally in the UK, some in Northern Ireland, but very relevant case law in relation to race. Then Stephany will talk about the charter from BITC in relation to race, and Roisin will talk about the Equality Commission's Equality Plan model, which complements the BITC charter. So it's a three-way split. So I'm going to look at case law because it is really important just to keep an eye on not just the good things that are happening in workplaces, but the bad things. Because very often the bad things are what leads to improvements and emerging good practice. So I'm going to look at 5 seminal cases on race. I'm not going to into them in detail, but I'll go through the basics and the important points for employers to be cognizant of. And we can send you links to any of these cases that you are particularly interested in. So the first case I want to cover is a very, it's a sort of traditional race case. And it represents the type of race case you would have got probably in the 70s after the introduction of race legislation in GB. but these cases still exist. So this relates to a recruitment and selection decision, and it relates to a failure of that recruitment and selection process being open and transparent. So nowadays in 2022, most employers in Northern Ireland realise the importance of having policies and procedures and ensuring that they comply with the codes of practice and the various codes, specifically the unified guide that we developed in 2009, which compiles guidance from across the 9 equality areas. But in this particular case, the employer didn't have a policy that reflected the guide. In fact, it was very remiss of them. The policy they had was an equal opportunities policy, but it did not reflect good practice. It didn't, for example, require that jobs be advertised, that recruitment should be open and transparent, that everybody who potentially was interested in the job, a job could apply. So what happened in this case was that this was a carpet manufacturer, still is a carpet manufacturer. There were 22 managers, of which 21 were white British. One person was from a minority ethnic group, one manager out of 22. So a senior manager's job became available, and Mr. Udden, who was a manager and had been a manager for 20 years, was very interested in this promotion, and quite rightly he expected it to be advertised, but it wasn't. The managing director of the company appointed another white male to the job, so there's no recruitment process. So Mr. Udden did the reasonable thing and followed the internal process and literally did not get anywhere. And the defense of the company was that they had an equal ops policy and they had followed this policy. But the policy didn't require that all jobs be advertised. So therefore, the company didn't advertise this job in line with their own policy. But the view of the tribunal in this case was that, looking at the context of this company, one manager from Black and minority ethnic community out of 22, in a situation where the workforce was much more representative of BME groups, the fact that the manager did not make any attempt to engage with Mr. Udden in relation to the job, that he simply appointed another white male, and the fact that the company didn't require that jobs be advertised, and therefore that recruitment and selection processes which were objective be in place, the tribunal drew an inference of race discrimination against the company. And the decision that was taken by the company was that the employer had engaged in race discrimination because Mr. Udden and other Black and minority ethnic communities were put at a substantial disadvantage by virtue of their race and their ethnic background. So in this case, the company lost. And the important thing here is the need to have your own policies, but to make sure that they comply with the guidance, notably the Equality Commission's guidance and codes of practice, and notably our unified guide from 2009. So that was important. Second of all, you need to have a recruitment and selection policy. And again, I could refer you there to the Commission's template policy, which you can use. So there are resources available to you to address the learning from this case. The second case is an interesting case because it's a public sector case. And very often we are advised and told, well, cases of race discrimination and other forms of discrimination are less likely in the public sector because they have policies and procedures and so forth. So that's why I want to bring you on to the next case, Marie, which is Ishak and against the London Borough of Ealing. And this case displayed racial harassment, and it particularly was concerned with the issue of training. And that's really important. Because of the digital transformation agenda going on in the public sector in Northern Ireland at the moment, there is a move towards using more digital resources. So this case is very pertinent here. So there was the individual was Mr. Ishak, and he had two other colleagues who were also from Black minority ethnic communities. And one of their managers referred to them allegedly as 3 Asian monkeys. Okay, so this manager, who was Mr. Cultus Pittman, referred to Mr. Ishak and his two colleagues as 3 Asian monkeys, which was obviously very derogatory. Now, he denied that he said that, and he said he talked to them as the three wise monkeys, which still many would assume was derogatory. So Mr. Ishak and his colleagues took an internal grievance. It didn't go anywhere because the investigating officer decided there wasn't enough evidence, and therefore it come to an end. So Mr. Ishak took the case to a tribunal, and he argued that this was racial harassment and this was discrimination. And the tribunal accepted the evidence of Mr. Ishak and his colleagues, did not accept the evidence of the manager, and the tribunal awarded in favour of Mr. Ishak and his colleagues. So this was racial discrimination, and this was harassment. But this case is interesting also for the reason of training, and another reason as well. So let's look at the training aspect of this. Once Mr. Pittman Cultus was charged with racial harassment, the employer did what any employer will do and attempted to shift the burden of proof by saying, look, we trained this guy, he knew not to do this, and therefore if there's any responsibility here, it's Mr. Pittman. However, when Mr. Pittman was called, it became apparent that Jesse had received equality training, but it had been online. And when questioned, he said that he can't remember the training because, quote, all of these online training sessions just roll into each other and it's very difficult to remember what's included in them. So the tribunal basically said, well, this was a woeful failure by the council to provide adequate training, particularly as well in a workforce that was diverse. So the tribunal concluded the training wasn't effective, and they recommended mandatory training on equality and diversity issues initially within 6 months of joining your employer, but thereafter every 3 years. But they said that any training, even if it was face-to-face, but specifically it was looking at online training, that there had to be measures in place to evaluate the learning of the attendee. So in other words, attendee had to be assessed as to the extent of which they understood the training and they could apply it in their job. So this wasn't saying no to online training or digital training, but it was saying that there have to be certain principles and policies which underpin it to make sure that it's effective. The third aspect of this case, which is interesting, again from a race perspective, is that it turned out that there was no complaints procedure in place for contract workers, and contract workers were a big proportion of the workforce here. So contract workers were not in a position to effectively make claims of discrimination. So as a result of the tribunal case, the company then were required to basically integrate contract workers into the same provisions and policies as non-contract workers. So it meant that they could not be treated in isolation, specifically where their rights existed in relation to discrimination. So that case was interesting from those 3 different aspects. The next one, moving on then, Marie, to this is a Northern Ireland case, and it's only a case from 2019. It's interesting because it's blatant racial harassment. And this was a Polish man who worked in a fast food joint called Sizzlers, which no longer operates. And he worked with another individual, Miss Fullerton, who made comments such as, go back to your own country. She bumped into him regularly. She caught his fingers in the fridge. There was this jostling going on. And then he returned to work from a wedding in Poland, and further comments were made, bad language was used, and he noticed increased isolation from all of his colleagues at that point, not talking to him. but some of them engaged in bad language, some of them in jostling. So he made a complaint. The company didn't address it seriously. Not only that, management in the company appeared to allow this harassment to happen. The working environment was described by Mr. Anzis, the Polish man, as poisonous. And there was a complete failure to address the harassment which was going on within the organization. He was left in a case there where, having exhausted the internal provisions as they were, he had nothing else he could do, but he took a complaint of racial discrimination. And again, the tribunal accepted his claim of racial harassment. And that, again, as I say, that was a local case in 2019. So those people who sometimes think that explicit racial harassment doesn't happen, it does. And this is an example of it. If we move on then, the next case I wanted to look at was the Ale Gellin case. And why I'm putting this up again, this is symptomatic of the case I mentioned earlier, the case of Ishak and the Borough of Ealing. And again, it relates to training. And I think it's important for you and for us in 2020 to be cognizant of the fact that with increased digitalization, there will be a move, and has been a move, towards providing training online. But the quality of the training, some of which I have seen myself, is very questionable. The training which relates to equality and harassment. And it's very debatable whether the training actually meets the basic standards that will be required. In other words, that the attendees, after attending the training, are aware of how they should behave and will continue to be aware of how they should behave. They're not going to forget over time. In this particular case, though, what's interesting here is that harassment occurred. And what became very evident was that there were employees within the company who behaved in a way which was racially discriminatory, and they engaged directly in harassment. They had been trained. Line managers who also had been trained just allowed harassment to occur. They didn't challenge it. They took no remedial action. There was a failure by the employer and their management to distinguish between banter and harassment. So they had had training in this company. The line managers had training. However, it did not result in behaviors that one would require or expect as a result of attending the training. So the tribunal basically saw the training as ineffective. It hadn't worked. So in this particular case, the employer would not have been able to have moved the burden of responsibility to their employees because the training they had provided was inadequate, ineffective, and was not fit for purpose. So again, it re-emphasizes that point about the quality of the training and the need to refresh training. And specifically here in relation to race, because I should have mentioned that the harassment and the discrimination which occurred in this particular case from 2021 was all race-based harassment. So the training the employer had provided did not result in their employees and managers behaving adequately. So the final case I'm going to look at on the next slide is also interesting because again, it deals with an issue which is pertinent to the race equality agenda. And in this particular case, there was a requirement here for an employee to have an interpreter. Essentially what happened in this case was that the employee was engaged, they were doing their job, the relationship was good, but over time, when information was being communicated, the individual, Ms. Polishan, did not fully understand the information that was being conveyed to her. And this came to a head when there was a disciplinary grievance taken. And as you can appreciate, there is a linguistic complexity involved there. And the individual did not understand the significance of some of the language that was used by the employer. So they didn't understand their rights or their responsibilities under the disciplinary policy. And as a result, did not understand the outcome or aspects of the outcome of the investigation that were conducted. And the result was ultimately that the individual employee was to be made redundant or be dismissed. So in this case, there was a serious employer-employee issue and process being undertaken with very significant implications for the employee. However, the employee was not in a position to fully understand these. And the tribunal ruled that there was a need for an interpreter in those situations where the importance of the language warranted the interpreter to be in place, where, in other words, the employee required an interpreter in order to fully understand the importance and the complexity of the process they were involved in. So that's a fairly new type of case in relation to race. And it's one that's it's very likely to increase or the number of cases addressing issues like this is likely to increase. And it's one maybe to be particularly concerned with. And you can imagine other aspects, for example, health and safety, where again, if there's the potential for miscommunication, it's imperative that the employer provides an interpreter in that particular case. So that's a run through some of the more important principles in relation to race. I wish I had a wee bit more time to go into it in more detail, but the key learning from it is racial harassment still happens. Explicit racial harassment still happens. Employers in some cases still don't have adequate policies, still don't thoroughly investigate complaints of racial harassment. Where there is an investigation, remedial action not always taken, and there can be an over-reliance on digital training at the expense of face-to-face training. And finally, with the increasing complexity of policies and issues being addressed in many workplaces, employers need to be cognizant of the requirement to have an interpreter. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've gone slightly over time, my apologies. But I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Stephany, who's going to talk about the Race Charter and is going to take the case law to some extent to examine how the Charter can help employees put in place a structure to prevent discrimination, but to promote positive behaviours with regard to race. So over to Stephany.
Thank you, Paul. That was really interesting. Thank you to hear. I think hearing about the case law around this topic is a stark reminder, isn't it, that employers, must take action to ensure that they're getting this right. So thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to keep my camera off during my presentation just to maintain Wi-Fi. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We do appreciate that you're making this a priority and that you're taking time out of your busy day to listen to us talking about race equality in the workplace. I'm going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about the Business in the Community Race at Work Charter. And for those of you who have attended the first two sessions of this webinar series, you'll already be aware of the Charter and its purpose. For those of you who are not yet familiar with the Race at Work Charter, it was launched by Business in the Community in 2018 with the aim of tackling ethnic disparities in the workplace. And the Charter requires signatories to make 7 commitments. Next slide, please, Marie. And here are those 7 commitments. So very shortly, I am going to spend a few minutes talking about each of them. But firstly, I just want to very quickly provide you with an overview of Business in the Community's objectives with this programme of work. So we want to encourage leadership, allyship and connections to foster advocates and allies that will proactively take actions to ensure that their workplace is safe and inclusive. We want to encourage businesses to take strategic action on leadership by bringing the attention of all senior leaders within their organisation to the issue of race relations. We support the promoting, the mentoring and sponsorship of ethnic minority employees by putting them forward for development or progression opportunities. And business in the community aims to co-develop or co-create race equality and inclusion strategies with people from all race equality groups. So for those employers here this morning who have signed the charter, and also for those who are thinking about it, I am going to share some actions that you can consider as part of the charter commitments, which can support you in improving race equality and inclusion within your workplace. So next slide, please, Marie. So the first commitment is to appoint an executive sponsor for race. So it's widely known that senior management sponsorship and buy-in is essential to getting momentum behind any diversity and inclusion initiative. And executive sponsors for race can provide that visible leadership on race and ethnicity, and they can drive actions from that senior level. So on this slide, you'll see a few key steps that an executive sponsor can consider when appointed. So firstly, one of their key priorities should be to build and articulate the case for change. This should include highlighting the range of benefits of embracing and targeting race as an organisation, and very importantly, how to engage the people. An executive sponsor should ensure that senior management have KPIs specifically related to race inclusion, and this will encourage them to commit and deliver on measurable positive outcomes. They should champion race equality throughout the organisation and ensure that race is and remains on the business agenda. And this could involve having race as a recurring agenda point at senior management team meetings, or senior management visibly supporting ethnic minority staff networks. An executive sponsor should challenge senior management to lead on race strategy, and they should encourage senior leaders to question the lack of diversity and commit to taking whatever action is needed for change. You know, you could get them to set targets for recruiting and promoting ethnic minority employees. This is an achievable action that could lead to sustained change. And finally, they should lead on the case for initiating ethnicity pay reporting. Businesses are being encouraged to introduce pay gap reporting for ethnic minorities, and you know, this would most certainly contribute to fairness on pay and progression. Next slide, please, Marie. Thank you. So the second commitment, and possibly one of the most challenging, is to capture ethnicity data and publicise progress. So you'll all be familiar here with the fact that collecting data can help to establish a baseline picture of where an organisation currently stands. It'll aid in setting aspirational targets for what an organisation expects to look like in the future. And data collection could give an opportunity to measure progress against those targets. And capturing ethnicity data is a crucial step towards reporting on ethnicity pay gaps and tracking performance against targets. And a data-driven approach is essential to both identifying areas of inclusion where improvements are required and monitoring the effectiveness of strategies, policies and programmes that you've put in place. So to make a start on this, your organisation should review the data that's already collected and then decide, is this sufficient to measure the ethnic minority demographic of the organisation? And if this isn't already done, then you would need to consider setting up a process for collecting ethnicity data. And when the data is collected, it should then be analysed so that you can identify patterns of underrepresentation. And then the business will need to consider how the data will be distributed and communicated. So for example, via an internal staff communication that you may have, or an annual report. And then meaningful actions should then be developed. And this could be done by developing an action plan to address the findings of ethnicity disclosure. An example of this could be to implement an action plan on how to increase representation at all levels within your organisation. And then finally, for this commitment, communicate a clear plan showing how your organisation will continue to collect data and report on progress, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of actions taken to address any lack of representation identified. And you should report the outcome to employees just to boost the confidence in your organisation's commitment to creating inclusion. Marie, the next one, please. So the third commitment is to commit at board level to zero tolerance of harassment. And I think everyone on this call will agree that all employers should be committing to actions that foster inclusion, total inclusion in your organisation. And when we talk about zero tolerance, it's vital that every employer has a dignity at work policy or framework in place, that a zero tolerance approach is enforced, and a firm approach is taken in line with that policy framework. Employers should be creating awareness with their staff and set out clear expectations of how employees should behave toward one another. And line managers have a really important role to play in preventing the escalation of incidents of bullying and harassment. So they have to feel confident so that they can deal with conflict if it arises. Therefore, training is essential for them. Marie, let's move to the next one, please. So the fourth commitment of the Charter is to make equality, diversity and inclusion the responsibility of all leaders and managers. So actions that could be considered here include setting performance objectives and KPIs for leaders and managers, giving them that responsibility to promote conscious inclusion and equal opportunity for all their staff. Now, we all know here that an inclusive organisational culture is where employees bring their whole selves to work and where they're empowered to thrive. So it's important that leaders and managers take ownership for delivering on diversity and inclusion in order to create an inclusive workplace. Senior leaders should have defined responsibilities for contributing to this culture, and essentially they should walk the talk. Getting their buy-in can be challenging, but it's essential. So you could consider possibly involving them in designing diversity and inclusion initiatives so that they have that input. Another action to consider here is including diversity inclusion on job descriptions. And you could even take it a step further and think about including it at interview as a competency-based question. And I mentioned a few moments ago that KPIs on diversity and inclusion for senior leaders should be considered. What about thinking about extending these to all staff within your organisation, such as a KPI around inclusively working as part of a team or supporting minority groups through activities? Marie, next slide, please. So the fifth commitment of the Charter is to take action that supports Black, Asian, mixed race and other ethnically diverse employees' career progression. So some things to consider here are support mechanisms such as two-way mentoring or sponsorship. Now, I briefly touched on both of these back in our last session in October, so I'm not going to be going into any more detail today, but some additional considerations are, think about professional working relationships and colleagues acting as sponsors or networking with peers. This can open doors to cross-departmental projects and new relationships. Think about offering ethnic minority employees the opportunity to work on a range of projects to enhance their skills and peer networking opportunities, and good quality people management is essential here. Line managers need to be trained to assess the skills gaps of their team and be able to effectively identify development opportunities. And we all know that training and development can contribute to career progression. Also, if we think about when we hire new employees, make sure that there's an effective onboarding process. And you could even consider offering a coach or a mentor during the first few weeks after a new employee starts, just to provide them with that support to settling in. And finally, where there's evidence of ethnic minorities being underrepresented in your organisation, take positive action measures to address this. Marie, can we move on to the next slide, please? So the sixth commitment, I hope you're all still with me, we're nearly there. The sixth commitment of the Charter is to support race inclusion allies in the workplace. Now, again, I did talk about allyship as a support mechanism at our last session in October, so I won't be going into detail on it today, but essentially allyship is it's a tool to enabling opportunities for ethnically diverse talent to thrive and progress, and it's a sustainable support mechanism that I think offers a unique and fulfilling journey to the ally. Allyship is about challenging and engaging those moments where bad behaviours are observed. Now, this commitment asks an organisation to provide support to allies in order to promote race equality in teams, at work and within communities. And as a responsible employer and employee, you should join and encourage others to join employee networks and get to know individuals from diverse backgrounds, hear their experiences and learn from them. Also, inviting a colleague from an ethnically diverse underrepresented group to join a meeting that they would not normally get to attend gives them insight into the discussion while increasing their visibility with those people in that room. And think about advocating. So next time you're in a decision-making position, use the opportunity to advocate on behalf of a colleague from an underrepresented group. This is a great way to boost their reputation and support them with their professional goals. And you can consider sponsorship. So this can involve helping to find opportunities for assignments, speaking opportunities, presentation opportunities. The aim is to help build their visibility internally and externally, which in turn will help to build their credibility. Move on to the next slide, please, Marie. And we're at the final commitment. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. We'll get to move on to Roisin soon. So the final commitment of the Charter is to include Black, Asian, mixed race and other ethnically led enterprise owners in supply chain. And those who completed actually the last few Race at Work surveys said that they wanted to see more role models from their own backgrounds in the workplace. So employers should ensure that these businesses and enterprises are part of their supply chains and should ensure that these suppliers have equitable access, treatment and outcomes within the supply chain and procurement. And these actions will contribute to creating role models for young people and the wider community, as well as economic inclusion. Marie, next slide, please. So thank you for listening to me. Signing the Race at Work Charter indicates your commitment to fostering race inclusion in your organisation. And by following through on the commitments that I've just talked very quickly through, this will ensure that your organisation has a clear direction and prioritisation of race equality in employment and career progression as well. So if you'd like to sign up to the Race at Work Charter, you can contact myself. My email address is on this slide, but I'll also pop it into the chat function. And I'm now going to hand over to Roisin from the Equality Commission, who is going to talk about their Race Equality Action Plan. So over to you, Roisin.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and good morning, everybody. I'm Roisin, I'm a colleague of Paul's with the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland. Essentially, I'm going to spend roughly around the next sort of 15 minutes or so just taking you through our draft Race Equality Action Plan. I just want to give you a little bit of information in terms of how we feel that the plan can assist you with your work in this area. So the first thing that I want to really emphasize, I suppose, is the point that the plan has been drafted very much to work as something that will complement the Race at Work Charter that Stephany has taken you through this morning. So it is our hope, and we do recommend that you work with both the Charter, BITC's Charter and our plan as well, that they complement each other. Okay, so you can feel free to amend the template in any way that you see fit in order to I suppose reflect any commitments within the Charter and to also reflect the language of the Charter. Okay, so it's very much a joined up approach. We do suggest that our plan can be adopted by signatories to the Charter and will ultimately be a really, really useful tool for you when it comes to actually implementing the commitments and organising and prioritising the actions that you're taking in relation to the work that you're doing around race and with the help of BITC. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Marie. Okay, so as you can see here, our draft action plan is essentially an example, really, of how a race action plan might be drafted. Okay, we recommend, and we do this with all of our work, that you guys as employers will amend the template plan as you see fit for your own organizational context, because every workplace is different. And your own circumstances are going to vary greatly from employer to employer. So it is a template, and it's something that, you know, provides an excellent framework, but ultimately it's for you to determine exactly what your own plan should look like. Okay. And just in terms of the name that you choose for the action plan, I mean, there are some kind of example ones. They do tend to vary from employer to employer. Employers will typically call them things like diversity plans, for example, or diversity and inclusion plans, or dignity at work plans. Ultimately, you know, again, it's a matter for yourselves, whatever you feel is most appropriate within your own organisation. Really, what we would always say to employers, and Stephany has touched on this already, it's about the content of the plan, and it's about putting that into visible practice. You know, all of the commitments that you make within the plan and all of the work that you say that you're going to do, putting that into visible practice within the organisation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so the plan is draft. Choose whatever name you feel fits best for yourselves. And we do recommend in the plan and elsewhere in our kind of standard advice and guidance for employers that you use this as an opportunity to either adopt all of the policies around equal opportunities matters. So your general equal opportunities policies, I would imagine most of you will have them in place already. Policies around dignity at work and harassment and bullying in the workplace. If you have them in place, which most of you will have, it may be a really, really useful opportunity to review those policies and to ensure that they are up to date, that they're reflective of the current legislative framework within Northern Ireland, and that they reflect all of the equality laws, including obviously the race equality legislation as well. So we have a suite of model policies that you can use, that you can review your own against, and we'd be happy to work with you in various ways, and I'll come on to talk about that as well in terms of our ongoing support with this work. So if you could move on again, please, Marie, thank you. So obviously the actions that you take in this regard are going to be crucial to all of this work, and there are examples of the types of actions that we recommend that employers take within the plan itself. Okay, and it talks about things like, and I know Stephany has touched on this already, so I'm not going to spend too long, but you know, how you're going to actually launch this plan, how you're going to launch the work. You know, it is about getting momentum for the work. It's about ensuring that you know, everybody can see that your senior managers are leading this from the front, and that the work is given sufficient publicity. So thinking about how you're going to launch the plan. Another key action that we recommend is establishing a race equality working group who are going to be responsible for taking all of this work forward, and again ensuring that it is very much a key priority for the organisation, and that it builds that kind of ongoing momentum as well. So obviously the actions that you take are going to be key, they're going to be fundamental, they're going to vary from employer to employer, and it's crucial that you select the most appropriate actions based on all of the information that is available to you in terms of your own particular workplace and what is relevant. Okay. I'm also going to talk a little bit about key actions in relation to employment specifically in a little bit more detail. So I will look at that really, I suppose, again, just to build on what Stephany has already talked about. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Marie, thank you. Okay, so how do we get to where we need to be? One of the most important steps that you can take as employers is gathering relevant data in relation to race within your workplace. So this is where your monitoring comes in, okay? And that's something that needs to be done at the outset and needs to be done in a timely way in order for you to gather insights and information into patterns and trends within your own workplaces, okay? And that as a matter of good practice, you have you establish systems and processes within your own workplaces to essentially monitor your applicants for employment and your employees, your promotees, etc., along racial grounds. You will probably be aware that this is not compulsory in Northern Ireland. Okay, it's a voluntary initiative, but certainly we recommend that any employer who considers themselves to be an equal opportunities employer will gather this information, because it's very, very difficult to do any of the work that we talk about unless you have that insight, those insights and that information. So monitoring is something that we could spend a whole session on, okay? And we do have a lot of information and support and guidance for employers in terms of how to capture the information, how to process the information, and to ensure that it's done in line with, you know, data protection, GDPR regulations. So we can advise you on that. A lot of you will already have systems in place for monitoring community background and sex within your organisation in line with the Fair Employment and Treatment Order. So there is a template system kind of there, and we give loads of advice and information and support on that. And we, you know, certainly we recommend that you may wish to use, you know, that system or a very, very similar system for monitoring on other grounds. But, you know, ultimately, again, you need to choose the most appropriate system for your own workplace. We are very happy to support you with that. Just ensure that you are compliant with GDPR. You can contact the Information Commissioner for advice around that, because obviously, you know, that any data that you're gathering in relation to, you know, a person's, you know, ethnic, community background, etc., is sensitive personal data ultimately. Okay, so ask us if you want more information around monitoring. If you could move on, please, Marie, to the next slide. Okay. So again, once you've gathered the information that you need, one of the most important steps that you can take as an employer is to conduct a race equality review. Okay, and I want to mention just a couple of brief points in relation to this. So firstly, once you've gathered your information and your monitoring data, it's about, you know, how do we review that? How do we draw meaningful conclusions from that? Okay. And the answer is it's going to be different for every organisation, because it can be difficult sometimes to draw meaningful conclusions from quantitative data alone. You know, depending on the size of your workforce, depending on, you know, how many people you have from different racial groups within, you know, each kind of working group within your organisation. So there's a number of ways that you can gather insights. So you have your quantitative data from your monitoring. There's also some employers find it really, really useful to look at things like staff surveys, you know, to get insights in that way, particularly where you have a smaller workforce and where you know, you're not really going to get insights from your monitoring data. Things like exit interviews as well can be really, really useful. So take you know, a rounded approach to your work in this area. Okay. It is really, really crucial that you examine your recruitment practices. Okay, so for example, you know, are we attracting employees from different racial groups to our organisation, or is there some work that we need to do around that? Asking questions like, you know, are candidates from various racial groups, for example, successful when it comes to applying for vacancies within the organisation, and when it comes to being promoted within the organisation? You know, are there any patterns and trends here that we're noticing? And that will give you, again, access to more insights and information. And hopefully then you can take a step back and have a look at any further work that needs to be done, for example, in relation to your recruitment practices. So, you know, the criteria that you're setting for specific posts, you know, are they strictly job related? Do the criteria that we set here strictly align to the job duties? And we do provide detailed training around recruitment and selection, ensuring that you're avoiding committing acts of unlawful discrimination, whether that be directly or indirectly, in your recruitment practices. You know, thinking about things like, you know, what qualifications are we asking for these roles, and are we considering overseas qualifications gained outside of the UK? Do we have a mechanism in place for that? Thinking about things like, you know, if we're asking for English language requirements for posts, are these genuinely essential, or are we asking for too much? Thinking about dress codes within the workplace, thinking about the culture within the workplace, that's really, really important. So there's so much work that can be done. You know, we're more than happy to discuss that with you and to give you more detailed information and advice around that. Okay. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Marie. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes then talking about positive action. So essentially, positive action is primarily a mechanism for removing barriers to employment. Okay, it's about the steps that you can take as an employer for ensuring that you are promoting and providing equality of opportunity for everyone. So there's a number of things there that are detailed on the slide that which may be appropriate. Some or all of them may be appropriate for you to consider. Okay, so talking about things like, you know, things that you will hopefully be doing anyway, you know, adopting fair recruitment practices and making sure that everyone is trained. Key staff are trained, and Stephany touched on this already. You know, your managers are crucial. Anyone who's involved in recruitment and selection, anyone who's involved with, you know, dealing with issues around, complaints around, you know, inappropriate conduct within the workplace, bullying and harassment, etc. So if you have those robust policies and practices which ensure that, you know, you are really a good employer when it comes to dealing with issues. So it's your recruitment, it's all of those, you know, kind of working environment issues. Thinking about things like welcoming statements as well, if and when appropriate. We do recommend that all employers use a kind of a general equal opportunity statement. Okay, when it comes to race specifically, if you do wish to use, you know, a welcoming statement. So, for example, if you are aware that, you know, we have a significant underrepresentation of people from a particular racial group, you can consider using welcoming statements. There are certain qualifying criteria, so we would recommend that you take advice. So, for example, if you wish to use a specific welcoming statement in relation to race, it must be the case that that particular racial group has not been represented at all within your workplace within the past 12 months, or there has been a you know, a very disproportionate representation of that particular racial group within the past 12 months. Okay, so contact us if you want more advice in relation to that. Similarly, if you want to provide vocational training specifically to particular racial groups, you will need to ensure that you meet the qualifying criteria again in relation to the 12-month thing that I mentioned already. And one other thing that I want to say as well is that you need to act with caution when it comes to positive action specifically. So there are certain positive action measures which employers may consider taking, which may actually be unlawful. So we do detail this within our draft plan. So for example, if you decide, you know, okay, we want to set targets and timetables in relation to race, we want to say, you know, ideally within the next year, 2 years, 3 years, we would like to increase our representation by X percentage. That's okay, that there's no issue whatsoever with that, set as an aspirational goal. However, when it comes to actually appointing individuals into posts within your organisation, it wouldn't be lawful to, for example, set aside jobs for people specifically who belong to a particular racial group, for example, or to appoint somebody, you know, to a post for that reason. So in other words, you know, you need to comply with the legislation, generally speaking. All recruitment to posts within your organisation must be based on merit. Okay, so it is about setting aspirational goals and timetables. It's about taking a step back, looking at the culture within your organisation, looking at your, you know, your recruitment practices, all of that work around your policies, implementation, training, etc. You know, ensuring that key individuals understand all of the work and what their own responsibilities are, as well as their rights under the policies. And and taking positive action measures, but ultimately ensuring that you are complying with the legislation in that regard. Okay. Again, just to reiterate, we are more than happy to work further specific questions on any of that. Okay, so if we can move on just to the final slide, please, Marie, because we're coming up to 11 now. I just want to finish off by saying this is just an example kind of timetable that's taken from our draft plan, gives you, I suppose, a flavour of how you could, you know, organise this work, I suppose. So ultimately, it's down to yourselves. But hopefully it gives you an idea of it, and it's a kind of a guidance tool or a framework that you can use for your work in this area. So I want to stop there because I don't want to go too far over the time that was allocated, and I just want to conclude by saying thank you very much for your time and for attending this morning, and again, please do contact us if you need anything further, and I'm going to hand you back over to Stephany just to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie.